Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. I'm joined today by Dr. Steve Carney, who is a retired command historian at Arlington National Cemetery, which has been a place of pilgrimage for some people since the mid 1860s. And the history of the cemetery is really a microcosm, isn't it, of the history of the United States. And so I'm looking forward to getting into a discussion about your role or roles throughout your career and about Arlington in particular. And before, though, we get into that, I'd love to hear a little bit more about who you are and how you became interested in history.
Sure. Well, first, Heather, thank you so much for the opportunity to do this. I've been looking forward to it for some time. So I'm glad we're actually recording today. Um, well, I've always been interested in history. I am confident that it came from all of my childhood visits to battlefields. So I grew up in Western Pennsylvania. So we had, a wealth of battlefields to visit, everything from French and Indian War, Battle of Bushy Line. And we were only a couple hours from Gettysburg and Antietam. So when I think of my most, kind of fond childhood memories of going on vacation, it would have been going on a vacation to a battlefield. So I'm sure that that's ultimately what generated my interest in, military history specifically. But when it comes to then kind of history and military history, I'm sort of, and always have been, all over the board. I mean, everything from ancient military history. For a long time, I was convinced that I wanted to focus on the ancient Near East, and specifically the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, and military expansion during the Middle Kingdom. Until I realized what all of the language requirements were for the advanced degree. So I went through a phase of naval history. I must have been sort of late middle school or early high school, and I devoured like At Dawn We Slept and Miracle at Midway. But I very quickly got off the naval history and back into back into Army history. But my focus, I think, really kind of became then, U.S. military history, specifically 19th century. And if I had to pick like one core area that's really my passion or that I enjoy the most, it would be the U.S. Mexican War. So that's what I've done. A lot of my work on is Mexican War in one way or another. And maybe I have in my retirement another way or two ways to look at Mexican War and sort of reinterpret it a little bit for a more general audience.
One of my ancestors from Tennessee fought in this war, and I'll follow up with you about this after. I've been trying to track down his military record, and I have a couple of records that indicate the unit he fought with, but I don't actually know where they fought. So that'd be cool. You're the first person that I've met that has this level of expertise. So part of the fun part about this podcast is meeting historians with broad areas of expertise that I can follow up with later. Like you suddenly become like a personal historian that I can just dial up and say, "Hey, I need to know this information," which is awesome. So yeah, as a military historian, your experience kind of tracks with other military historians that I've spoken with and other historians, cultural historians I've spoken with it that have a really deep kind of grounding, so to speak, within the U.S. battlefields, visiting as children, and then kind of developing this like niche area of interest that may change over time. How did you end up at Arlington? And what was that like as because you were also an Army historian that then, so were you an Army historian that your place of employment was Arlington, or did that come after?
Okay, so uh, in the early 2000s, I was teaching adjunct faculty at, I think, when I took the job working for the Army, 5 different colleges and universities. So I had a trek. It must have been about 130 miles round trip to hit all the places that I was teaching at. So right after 9/11, the Army, well, all the services, really started to increase the size of their civilian workforce, which had been, at a significantly lower level since the President Clinton kind of like reduction in force and the shrinking of the federal government. So the position that I was ultimately hired into at the U.S. Army Center of Military History, located at Fort McNair in Southwest DC, literally right across the river from Arlington, um, they had been operating at like a 30 or 40% deficit over their baseline authorization from really the mid 1990s. So after 9/11, there was this kind of surge in civilian hiring. So I spent from late 2001 basically to about early 2011 working at the U.S. Army Center of Military History. And I started my first year or so, I was a book writer. And the project that I was working on at the time was sort of a single volume history of the U.S. Army and the Mexican War, which we ended up, because I changed positions there, we ended up kind of releasing the chapters that I had written as part of like a commemorative pamphlet series that was focused on campaigns of the U.S. Army. So all the campaign streamers on the Army flag, the intent was to have, a kind of a commemorative guide for each one of those campaign streamers. The position that I took at CMH was, I guess, theoretically, it was called the Director of Military History Education. So that involved running a number of conferences, both here in the United States, a biennial conference of Army historians, but I also worked with a lot of international conferences. So an annual conference in Europe and then a biennial one with the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force as well. But my day-to-day job was really focused on staff rods. So I had the opportunity really to revive at CMH the staff ride program. I think when I got there, just because of sort of years of again downsizing and tighter budgets, they were doing maybe 10 or 12 staff rides a year. And when I took that job, my boss said to me, my goal is to like at least double, if not triple, the number of staff rides we're doing. So happy to say most of those like 10 years or so I was running that program, I was doing like between 60 and 70 staff rides a year. So it kept me gainfully employed and out of trouble in a lot of ways. Um, but then in 2010, right, there was a big controversy that occurred at Arlington National Cemetery. Mismanagement. There were a lot of issues. And one of the identified issues during that time period was there really wasn't truly a command history office, a history office that there would be an expectation that any Army organization, any Army unit of any size would have a defined history office, command history program. And that just didn't happen at Arlington. The historian that was there, I think when he retired, probably had worked there for over 30 years. He was a historian. He also did over, I think, 3 or 4 thousand funerals as a funeral rep during his time there. Every school group that came and laid a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier, he would create a certificate for them to take home. So he had a lot of jobs, and history really wasn't one of them. So a call went out at CMH for volunteers to go and support the Arlington National Cemetery history program, and then to go over as, like a historical support team or a historical away team. And that was, one of the things that I learned very quickly was a lot of people, other historians at CMH, didn't realize that the Army has and always has administered and run Arlington National Cemetery from the creation of the first military cemetery in May of 1864 all the way through today. So I went over as part of that away team on what I was told was a detail. Um, and they said, "Oh, you'll go there for about 90 days." So 90 days turned into 6 months. 6 months turned into a year. Uh, so I basically was at Arlington for uh, a little over 2 years as kind of running the history support team until they hired me as the command historian. So they created positions for an, honest to goodness command history office, the way the Army would, kind of dictate how a history office should be shaped. So yeah, I was there. I officially got hired in 2013 and I retired in 2025. So I guess technically it was about 12 years I was the command historian there, but the 2 years previously I was, on that or running that historical support team.
Yeah, thank you for that chronology. It's helpful for me to sort of understand how this evolved for you and also how I think history within the Army evolved sort of tracking along with your own career. Arlington is a very special place. I've been a number of times. And as you were talking about the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, I've been to the changing of the guard and wreath laying ceremonies several times. And I was reflecting back on the first time I was there was as an 8th grade student, as so many 8th grade students. I've talked about this trip on this podcast many times because it was so transformational for me in terms of the work I'm now doing with battlefield pilgrimages and pilgrimages to military cemeteries and memorials and monuments. And the night, so there were 2 students from our school who had been selected to lay the wreath with 2 students from other schools. I think there were 4 students. And one of the students from our school was my roommate. And the night before, actually, I think it was the morning of, it was very early the morning of the ceremony, she burned her eye with a curling iron. And so it created, this big crisis where our chaperones had to take her to the emergency room. She gets an eye patch. And so the photos of our group at the ceremony and the wreath laying is the student with an eye patch on. And that's sort of how, like, there's a double commemoration there happening. One, the very important commemoration, laying the wreath at the tomb, and the other, my friend Autumn with her eye patch over the eye, that then sort of gets memorialized now in the photographs from that day. These student trips are an important part of, I guess, the groups that come to Arlington. The education piece is really important, and I can imagine that being a historian is rewarding and challenging because the materials and the tours and the information you're providing really has to be age appropriate. And you're working with 8th grade students, but also younger children ranging to older adults, and then into family members who are there for funerals of their loved ones. And so that is really a breadth of experience that you would have gained in this role.
Yes. So, there are a number of ways that even though I was a public historian for those 10 years before I went to Arlington, the my my perception of what being a public historian really meant changed a lot at Arlington for, well, that big reason that you've already mentioned, those kids that are coming in either as organized school groups or with their families. And again, I remember my first trip to the cemetery. It's probably one of my earlier memories. I must have been 7 years old or so. And my uncle worked at the Pentagon, so we came down to visit him. And of course, I'm pretty sure we got into town, and the first stop we made was at Arlington. Going, I don't remember the Kennedy gravesite as much, but being at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and seeing the changing of the guard certainly had an impact on me. I guess I would add that in with the battlefield visits. that I did as a kid as well, as that genesis of my interest in history. But once I got there and was working at Arlington, I started to, understand that my job was no longer really focusing my content for my primary audience, which was the Army, right? So staff rides, I mean, I didn't do those for the general public. That was for, military, Army mostly, but the other services and DoD groups, so kind of getting that, storytelling methodology to really make it accessible not only to the American general public, regardless of age, but to the international audience as well. I can remember one of the first times I was outside the Memorial Amphitheater it must have been sometime in the summer, June, July-ish, and the number of foreign language speakers that as I was just kind of walking around, I was shocked. And it was the first time I guess it really clicked to me of how many international visitors also we had coming to Arlington National Cemetery as well. So yeah, it changed my thinking significantly. One of the things I'm maybe most proud of at my time at Arlington was the opportunities that we missed with all of those students that come to the cemetery daily, really year round because, quite frankly, the history office, we didn't, we weren't set up, we didn't have the capacity to be able to do tours, for sometimes any of those school groups that were coming. So I really wanted to ensure that we had educational materials that, any teacher that was planning that eighth grade trip or any other trip with their students could use in the classroom to prepare their students for what they were going to see at Arlington or to use in the classroom after they got back. So we created a education program. All of it is available for free right from the Arlington National Cemetery website. And it really was a way that I thought we could reach all of those. And it's thousands a day, right? Thousands of students literally daily through these materials that are geared, again, for their teachers or for a student that's interested to be able to utilize for a project, but also, and one of the points that you made that I was very glad to hear is it's not just those eighth graders, it's the younger kids that are coming, it's the older kids. So all of those materials that we created, we made available sort of at the elementary, fourth or fifth grade level, middle school, the eighth grade level, and high school, basically the 12th grade level, as well as materials for lifelong learners, so that anyone, hopefully coming to the cemetery would be able to access and use those materials and at least help them, you know, come with a little bit more of a sense of like personal meaning, reflection, reverence, versus it's just Arlington National Cemetery opens earlier than most places in Washington, D.C., closes at about the same time now, but, you know, open 365 days a year. So it more than it just being a place to go out of curiosity or because you're staying at a hotel in DC and the concierge says you have to go to Arlington National Cemetery and go watch the changing of the guard. So again, that's probably my most proud accomplishment from my time at Arlington was the establishment of that education program.
Yeah, and you should be proud of that. That's a massive undertaking. I mean, I've been an educator for nearly 20 years and probably even before that, but formally, and the preparation of educational materials is time consuming, not only in writing, but deciding what will be included, what's going to be omitted, and why, and being able to have a clear decision making kind of uh, process about what is being included. And I also want to commend you for having the forethought to include in these education materials information that can be accessed after the fact. A lot of my work around pilgrimage studies has focused around the integration of some type of pilgrimage or other transformational travel experience. And I find that often people sometimes they don't intend for an experience to be a pilgrimage, and they feel a sense of disorientation and ask questions that maybe they up to this point hadn't been asking. And so I think being able to come back and engage the site through the educational materials is an important aspect of an overarching educational program.
Yes. And, that dovetails so well with staff rides, right? Because the sort of Army manual, the official breakdown of how to do a staff ride, it's three phases. It's the preliminary study, it's the train walk or the battlefield visit, and then it's the integration phase. And my non-negotiable for all of my groups was like the integration phase is truly of the three the most important, in my opinion.
I agree.
So yeah, so I definitely brought kind of that thought process to the Arlington program. And part of it might have been just the way things are, right? A teacher might not have any idea that there's this education program or education materials, but maybe while they're walking around Arlington and would see one of the QR codes there or some other reference to the education program, that I wanted to ensure that they could use that back in the classroom and really serve as the kind of capstone to that experience and hopefully enhance it already, more than what students already might be feeling themselves from the actual visit.
I'm thinking that this podcast has a growing subscriber list, which I'm really grateful for. And the reach of the podcast is actually international. And there are probably a lot of people that are listening or watching this podcast who may know what Arlington National Cemetery is, or they may know that there's a national cemetery around Washington, D.C. And I also think that we have an opportunity, because we have an expert here on this episode, to be able to talk through what is the history? Why was Arlington created? How has it evolved? Like I mentioned at the beginning, it is a place of pilgrimage for many people. But what is undisputed, some people may say it's a place of pilgrimage, but beyond that, it's a place of visitation, of somber sacred visitation. And I'd love to hear more about the history and how the cemetery has evolved.
Well, the birth of the cemetery is the Civil War, right? And in 1862, a system of national cemeteries was established to ensure the proper care of all the Civil War dead. Um, Arlington wasn't the first national cemetery. It wasn't even the first in Washington, D.C. But by May of 1864, there is a big issue the Army is facing in the D.C. area, and that was lack of burial space. So one of the things that I always talk about is, Washington, D.C. Uh, there are no cemeteries in DC, right? You have Congressional Cemetery all the way at the end of Pennsylvania Avenue, southeast. But aside from that, all of the cemeteries were further north, and that was due to space concerns, but also proper ground for burials. Not sort of the swampy area that so much of Washington D.C. was. So there's going to be this real lack of burial space. So in 1862, 1863, there were essentially two national cemeteries that were established in the DC area. One at the Soldiers' Home, so about maybe 3 miles north of the White House. And then the Alexandria National Cemetery across the river in Alexandria, Virginia. The Soldiers Home National Cemetery was a pretty small plot of land. And by 1864, was essentially filled to capacity. Kind of goes back to understanding how the medical evacuation system works in the Civil War. So if you were fighting here in the Eastern Theater of Operations and you were wounded or felt ill on the march or in one of the battles, if you survived those initial triage and surgery at a field hospital or a division level hospital, ultimately you would make your way back to one of the hospitals in Alexandria, DC, or Georgetown. And as we all know, disease was such a killer during the Civil War. In hospitals from infections, from wounds, etc. So there are unfortunately a lot of service members who are dying in the area at one of those hospitals, and the Army needs burial space. So by May of 1864, which for anyone interested in the Civil War, that coincides with the kickoff of what we would now call Grant's Overland Campaign, there is a need for additional burial space. So the 1,100 acres that was Arlington Plantation had been seized by the Army on May 24th, 1861, just a few hours after Virginia officially announces that it has seceded from the Union. The Army occupies Alexandria and the Arlington Plantation, primarily because of the ridge that runs there on the western side of the cemetery. Anyone who visits the Arlington and go to the Arlington House, you know, the biggest takeaway, in my opinion, is you absolutely have the commanding high ground over the District of Columbia, and you literally can see just about every critical federal building in the city. If whoever controls that high ground will ultimately control Washington D.C. So the Army had occupied and administered that property since 1861. So in May of 1864, after the wilderness kind of campaign had already kicked off, wilderness going into Spotsylvania courthouse, additional burial space is needed. So the Army makes a military cemetery on sort of the northern extent of the Arlington Plantation property. So from about May 13th to June 15th, it's really just kind of an ad hoc military cemetery where all burials are taking place, because the day the burials start at Arlington, May 13th, the Soldiers Home National Cemetery closes to new interments. So all those burials are going to be taking place at Arlington. On June 15th of 1864, a 200-acre national cemetery is established on Arlington Plantation. So the cemetery goes from an ad hoc military cemetery to a full-blown national cemetery. So that's the genesis of it. It was a 200-acre Civil War cemetery. One of the big turning points in the history of the cemetery was just a couple years after the Civil War, when on May 30th of 1868, John Logan and the Grand Army of the Republic, declare that that day is a decoration day, and our national commemoration of all those who fell at Arlington during the Civil War would take place at Arlington National Cemetery. So, as one of my big interpretive themes for any group I would talk to at the cemetery is, from 1868 to today, our nation's somber day of remembrance, of memorializing, of memorialization, of memorialization takes place at Arlington National Cemetery. Really did change the whole future of the cemetery. No longer was Arlington just one of a number of national cemeteries that were created during or just after the Civil War, but it raised to a level of prominence because of its association with Decoration Day. So Arlington truly is what it is today. Uh, I would argue because of decoration, and of course, decoration and Memorial Day started to be used interchangeably probably by the late 1870s. Although the official name of that day of remembrance didn't become Memorial Day until 1971. But Memorial Day, you can't separate Memorial Day and its importance from the overall history of Arlington. But what did that kind of rise in prominence do for the cemetery? Well, we now are not, weren't just a cemetery where individuals were buried because they died during the Civil War. You had, officers, wealthy individuals who survived the war. And as they're thinking about their end of life and where they want to be buried or where their families want to bury them, Arlington's a great option because it is this premier national military cemetery. And they have the opportunity to be buried near the men they led who fell in the Civil War. And I say buried near because after Arlington became a national cemetery in June of 1864, it was segregated. And that is not just by race, but by rank as well. So you have white enlisted sections, black enlisted sections, and then officer sections. Officer sections were segregated by rank, but not by race. So African American officers were buried in officer sections at the cemetery. By, we're at the turn of the 20th century, the other kind of significant thing that happened at Arlington is after the Spanish American War, for the first time, service members were repatriated at the government's expense for reburial in the United States. So whether they fell in the Caribbean or in the Philippines, the government would repatriate them. And many of those fallen service members from overseas were buried at Arlington. So the 260, 230 of 260 or 266 crew members who were killed during the explosion of the USS Maine are buried at what at the time was called the main section. Enlisted personnel were buried in the two of the Spanish American War sections, one for white enlisted, one for black enlisted. And that kind of continued all the way through World War One with repatriations after World War One and the establishment of the World War One sections. So the cemetery in kind of the early 20th century, really up to World War II, very much, I would say, a site of pilgrimage in that, you specifically could, uh, pay homage to the Civil War sections or to the Spanish American War sections. So there was this really kind of interesting development of the landscape and how those sections were identified. And again, through World War One, each of those sections were also marked with a monument or memorial to commemorate the event, why all those individuals were buried there. So at Arlington in the Spanish American War sections, there are actually 6 separate monuments or memorials just commemorated to that conflict. So there are actually 2 memorials for the USS Maine victims and those buried there. There's the Spanish American War Memorial, the Spanish American War Nurses Memorial, a kind of regimental marker to the Rough Riders, and another to African American soldiers who served as Buffalo soldiers in that conflict. So this kind of early 20th century Spanish American War through World War One was critical, I think, to the continued development of Arlington and its prominence in the history of our nation. And then you add in, of course, in 1921, the dedication of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And then, you know, another turning point was the decision for President John F. Kennedy to be buried at Arlington and not, you know, in Massachusetts or somewhere else, because in the 1960s, then not only does the president's burial again sort of elevate Arlington's position in the minds of a lot of Americans, but Americans got to see what a full honors funeral looks like at Arlington, thanks to the televised funeral, President Kennedy's televised funeral. So not only does President Kennedy's burial kind of play a role in the development of the cemetery, it also forced some pretty significant changes in that now demand for burial at Arlington skyrocketed. Before President Kennedy's burial, the cemetery was doing essentially about 1,000 funerals a year. And by 1966 or 1967, the number of requests for burials had increased to well over 12,000, 14,000 per year. Now, not all of those were, of course, eligible for burial there, but it grew, the demand for burial space at Arlington a great deal. So really, since 1963, with President Kennedy's burial, one of the themes is that of expansion. The need to expand the cemetery in order to keep it an active cemetery, an active burial spot. Like within the past decade, there was one expansion called it was called the Millennium Expansion, because it was kind of planned around the turn of the 21st century. But right now, there is also another expansion going on kind of to the south towards the Pentagon and the Air Force Memorial, which hopefully will give the cemetery space for burials into the 2060s or so. But again, President Kennedy's funeral has really changed over those decades, 60 plus years now, of kind of the need for space in order that Arlington remains a active cemetery, and so into the future and potentially future conflicts.
When you were describing the media attention around President Kennedy's funeral and then what that has meant for the increase in the numbers of applications for burials at Arlington, I was thinking about a parallel situation that I'm sure you're very familiar with the death of Quentin Roosevelt, and how his parents were, as particularly Mrs. Roosevelt, was very instrumental in giving speeches to convince other American mothers and families to leave their sons buried in France. So it's kind of opposite, but it is interesting how the political the prominence of political families has shaped burial practices in the United States.
Yes, great point.
And also I was thinking about the timing of the cemetery's formation being the American Civil War. And this is also the era where burial practices, military burial practices change. And not just the burial practices, but the marking of graves is changing, where there's one person or a marker with a name and some information about that person, which changes the landscape of pilgrimages, because there's a grave to visit that represents this person and this person's life. And the same thing is happening in Europe after the Franco-Prussian War, where individual graves, it's not just mass graves for soldiers and then the officers, there are individually marked graves. And that also, at the almost the same moment in history, starts changing their perspective of how families and other loved ones can now engage with these grave sites, which sort of flips the situation so that the gravesite itself becomes the place of pilgrimage.
Yeah, and So interesting. Just as you were started talking about that, well, a million things were running through my mind, but also there, one of the I think really unique characteristics, or one of the things that makes Arlington a unique landscape, is because you do have, even in the enlisted sections, you will sometimes find private markers, but as the Army was moving from wooden headboards to a more permanent marker, ultimately ended up being Vermont marble, but it could have been some other options as well. But so while you have, these sections, certainly any section that's been established since July 1st of 1948, it's government furnished markers only. But when you go to those older sections, again, whether enlisted, but of course you see it a lot more in the officer sections, these incredible works of sculpture and art that are these incredible, absolutely incredible private markers that families paid for. I recently did some research about Louis Comfort Tiffany designs at Arlington, right? And just the craftsmanship on those individual markers is it's immensely impressive.
Mhm.
So yeah, so it's not even, the kind of that move to individual graves and kind of a standard headstone, but there's also that piece of, those who could afford it, the level of art and artistry and craftsmanship in some of those private markers at Arlington. It's really breathtaking, especially when there were no rules about the size of them. I think the tallest private marker is about 31 feet tall, and that's the pedestal, an angel on top of it, and she's kind of pointing up. So the tip of her finger is like 31 or 32 feet in the air. Yeah, absolutely incredible. So yet another way to kind of visit Arlington. It's not even necessarily about just visiting the individual grave sites or group um, markers or the monuments and memorials that are there, but also to visit just some of these incredible works of art. So, you know, I certainly see a cemetery, the same way I would see kind of any, it's an outdoor museum. I think of it as I would a battlefield as well. It's really an outdoor classroom, and there are so many ways to explore and so many different things to focus on.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you've talked about the outdoor classroom. These are places of artistic beauty and significance and architectural and artistic history. They're also, and I just the podcast that's going to be published tomorrow, I got into talking about this with the guests. They're also, these cemeteries are places of communion and connection for people that often result in conversations that are more significant. I mean, they get kind of straight at the connection point for humanity, and I'd love to see more written about that. I'd love to write more about that, actually, the more I've thought about it, because there are important places. You talked about the international visitors that are coming and international pilgrims. And these are places where we can kind of get along. They're places where we can envision the world we want to live in because we're looking at the price of peace that's here. I mean, where it's cutting through all of the fluff and kind of the noise and political arguments to say, look, this is what it costs to live in a peaceful world. And so they're also places of inspiration that provoke thought about how we could live together in a unity with each other, in peace with each other, and prosperity with one another. And I love that about these cemeteries.
That's that's so well said and so powerful. If you're ever looking for anyone to collaborate with, I know somebody who's retired and probably has a little, has a little bit of time.
Wow, this is another great thing about this podcast. Like, I am loving the collaborations that are coming out of it. I was also thinking about going back to the Civil War history of Arlington. A lot of my work on post World War I pilgrimages has been informed by the magnificent work of others that have written about post-Civil War pilgrimages, which were often they often occurred because of a reunion or a significant anniversary of a battle, even leading up to during World War One. I'm thinking of the big Shiloh pilgrimage, which was a really important pilgrimage because of the practices and the monuments that were being dedicated, but also how it impacted post World War One pilgrimages. I think there's a direct link there between this 1917 pilgrimage and the pilgrimage, especially to Bella Wood, that followed through the 1920s and 30s. And I wondered if Arlington was ever the setting for any of these reunion pilgrimages.
That's a great question. My so especially for the time period that we're talking about, um, I would say that 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 kind of pilgrimage was geared at Memorial Day, right?
Okay.
It was truly so, you mentioned like significant date or anniversary. So for Arlington, I would say at least up to and maybe through World War One, it was largely that, May 30th or fourth Monday of May, when it gets changed. But that was kind of the day. So as I think about kind of like early visitation or even reading some of the documents about why was this place where it was? Well, because on Memorial Day, this is where, 25,000 people come, so that's why this is going to be located here and maybe not on the other side of the cemetery. So I don't know of any, sort of like reoccurring or significant pilgrimages that took place specifically at Arlington versus again maybe one of the battlefields in the area. The one exception might be, this is oddly specific, but the veterans of the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, it's quite specific because there are actually 2 regimental markers at the cemetery. And the one I already mentioned was the Rough Riders. So of course that was post Spanish American War. So there was a big pilgrimage there for the dedication of that memorial. But the other one, so Civil War focused, was the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery. So they have, and it's right along one of the burial sections. Historically, it was called the Western section, which basically denoted that it was an officer section. Today, we call it Section 1. And so right there, as you're walking down that sidewalk, that pathway, there is this regimental marker. So I know that this 2nd Connecticut, they did have a pretty significant event at the cemetery at the dedication of that memorial. So yeah, so and then the Rough Riders. But those are really the only 2 kind of from that early period that really stand out to me. And just as a little bit of a bonus fact, anytime someone tries to play like Stump the Historian or used to try to play Stump the Historian with me at Arlington, my go-to answer would always be 2, right? How many regimental markers are there? 2. How many presidents are buried at the cemetery? 2. How many equestrian statues? 2. How many mausoleums? 2. So I always think the safest answer, if you don't know, is 2.
that's probably a good rule of thumb, too. A rule of 2 thumbs, actually. Uh, Yeah, I so Memorial Day makes a lot of sense. Decoration Day originally, Memorial Day. I'm thinking now of the overseas cemeteries, the American Battle Monuments Commission cemeteries that are overseas. Memorial Day has become that time of pilgrimage, or at least that focal point for memorial activities and ceremonies. And the one I'm most familiar with is the one at En Marne, which is in Bello, and the whole weekend. I mean, there are a growing number of ceremonies, people coming from everywhere to participate in this somber but also celebratory occurrence of people gathering to remember all soldiers. I mean, this is now opened up to a ceremony at the municipal cemetery, which is incorporating Memorial Day themes, but like overlaid into the cemetery, which is an interesting development. And of course, there's a large, well, it's a small, physically small cemetery, German cemetery, but there's a large number of Germans buried there. And so that's become a focal point of ceremonial activities and commemoration and memorialization with units coming from Germany and across Europe. And so this is an interesting it's interesting to see the evolution of Memorial Day and how that has oriented around our military cemeteries. It does seem like a trend that is growing and certainly will keep us busy as people who are interested in writing and reading and speaking about these activities. I also have a question for you about there's so many soldiers and Marines and, well, I should say service members because there's also a Navy doc that's buried at Enmarn. So I've become really attached to many of these, and every time I'm there, I learn more. But there are set graves that I visit at Enmarn, and I pay my respects. Most of them are from New Hampshire, where I live now. But I can tell you stories about these individual service members and their families and where they are from and their immigration status, because this is really something that is very special to me is seeing how many of these soldiers died who were not yet citizens of the US. And I'm sure you probably have a lot of stories, maybe even at Arlington for this particular group. Are there like it's probably hard to narrow it down, but I'd love to hear just a couple of stories about some of the people that you've connected with through time and space and death, because you didn't actually meet them, but you've come to know them probably through either unit histories or letters or photos or family stories. Who are some special people that you have connected to or with that are buried at Arlington?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think some of my earliest work at the cemetery when we weren't literally going through and trying to find, like, crawling through various spaces at the cemetery looking for documents or blueprints or maps. Some of my earliest work at the cemetery was in section 60, and section 60 is a newer section. It was established in about 1972. So it was in on the kind of east side of the cemetery, which was the first big expansion that took place after President Kennedy's burial. A master plan that was commissioned for the cemetery after Kennedy's funeral indicated that at the current rate of burials, that the cemetery would essentially run out of space by 1980. So there were a number of ways to mitigate that, and one of them was this first kind of expansion in the cemetery. So Section 60 was one of those kind of early expansions in the 1970s. Really interesting section as you get out and walk in there, but it has been, for most of that time since 1972, one of the active first interment sections. So there ends up being a lot of active duty funerals that take place there. Um, I think one of the first burials in that section was actually a Spanish American war veteran who would have passed sometime in like 1972 or 1973. Uh, but as you walk that several acres, I think it's about 11 acres if I remember correctly, you walk through, of course, World War One veterans, World War Two, and then you get into Vietnam and sort of the post-Vietnam War. Ultimately, as you get down to about an acre of it, is where a lot of the fallen from the global war on terror are buried. So Operations Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom. So we ran a program there, the Section 60 Memorial Collection. So think of the work the National Park Service does at the Vietnam War Memorial in collecting items that are left there at grave sites. So the Army instituted a what at the time in 2009 was called a pilot program. But the intent was to go out and collect items left at grave sites because, you know, just like the Vietnam War Memorial, right? The amount of items being left as a remembrance or a form of grief uh, was really kind of incredible. Like the number of just items that would be left at many, many, many of those grave sites. So I spent a lot of time walking that section and photographing and documenting and collecting items. But as I was walking through one day, I came to three grave sites kind of in a row, and the names looked familiar to me. Uh, and then I looked at the dates of death, and they were all October 3rd, 1993. So they were two Army Rangers and one Delta operator that were killed in the Battle of Mogadishu. And I, I that gave me a feeling. For me, I can remember being in my dorm in college and walking by the common room, and what I saw on television were the fallen service members being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, and it uh, that stuck with me. I guess talking to other people, sort of you know them remembering the last helicopter leaving Saigon, or it that imagery. It's something that I've never forgotten. Um, so the burial of those fallen from Mogadishu, it's one of pretty much any time I would be on that section of the side of the cemetery or in section 16. Those were three of the grave sites that I would always stop at. The second one was Don Carlos Faith Jr. So Task Force Faith at Chosin Reservoir in the Korean War. I had written something, you know, forever ago about Task Force Faith, and I was at the cemetery. I was doing something by the Coast Guard Memorial, and it was kind of getting out. Like one of the most difficult things about working at Arlington was trying to really make yourself educated about, like, well, who's buried here? What is this section? What are some of these grave sites? Like if I'm taking someone through or someone stops me, like what are they going to ask me about? Who are they looking for? Specifically. So as I was walking, I found the grave marker of Don Carlos Faith Sr. and his wife, and on the back was a memorial marker to Don Carlos Faith Jr. because he had not been recovered. So that was maybe like early 2011. I stumbled on that, and so I thought, oh, this is absolutely amazing. And about a year later, I was there at the active duty full honors funeral for Don Carlos Faith Jr. So in one of the exchanges, the North Koreans, some of the remains they turned back were positively identified as Don Carlos Faith Jr. So now he's buried and has his own individual marker as well. So that would always be another gravesite I would stop by. And then I guess the third one for me, very artistic. It's this absolutely beautiful. Uh, the person buried there is Thomas Hudson McKee. He was a lieutenant in the Civil War. So I started researching just the style of the marker. Just really really impressive. And when you're standing there, that's kind of all you see. But if you step off to either side, behind it, there is another grave marker to a general rank officer that is completely obscured by this McKee marker. So as I started to look into it, McKee was a staff officer for that general, and they seemed to have a great relationship. Um, the people that did not have the great relationship were Mrs. McKee and the general's wife. So the generals had passed first, had the marker placed. So McKee's wife, after he passed away, commissioned the same artist that created that uh, marker for the general, using the same type of stone, etc., but making it large enough so it completely blocked that marker behind it. That was, I think, my big takeaway there was sometimes the best revenge is actually served in death, I guess. But it was a great one to. I would always stop by just because that story. Uh, I really always enjoyed that story. So, and I could go on and on and on, but those would be my top three, I would say.
Yeah, in each of those situations, the humanity is there. In the last one, this is a very human human response, right? We don't like people. We're gonna take it out in some way, or and so it's funny that it is as permanent as it could be. I mean, if the monument crumbles, it's not permanent, but I there is some like kind of humorous poetic justice there. Um, and I mean, I think researching cemeteries and dead people, sometimes I say I chase dead people for my job. That's it changes a person, I think. I find a lot of the people that I know who work in this space, either military historians or people who work in what could be labeled as dark tourism or dark pilgrimage, who are working with sites of conflict and violence and death, to people who work in cemeteries. I it changes us to the point that we know how fragile life is. We are faced every day with the inevitability that we will be dead at some point. So I do think it changes how we live. And I think it also changes what we prioritize. So much of life seems very trivial when placed in the context of these cemeteries and wall panels or names on a memorial. I think it just puts life into perspective a bit. I wonder how it has changed you as a historian, how it's changed how you see history, how you see military history, or how it's changed you as a storyteller, what you prioritize when you're giving tours or you're leading staff rides or you're talking to groups of people. What has evolved for you over the years?
So, at a fundamental level, absolutely the perspective on life and death and what is important and what's meaningful. And uh, that certainly is like, I would say, the biggest takeaway of those, you know, 12 plus years of me being at Arlington, because not only was I actively working in that space and I would be out in the cemetery. Maybe not every day, but most days. There's also the fact that Arlington is a very active cemetery as well. There would be up to like 30 funerals a day there. So just being exposed to, those active emotions that you see every every day really, I think, also ended up impacting my views of life and death, as well. On top of that, that program I was telling you about in Section 60, that collection, program, a memorial collection, then you were we were exposed, almost daily to very raw and visible, like, emotions of grief. And I would say that one of the best things the Army did for me in my 20, just short of 24 years of being an Army civilian was the grief counseling and the grief training that I went through, right? Because there were some early days there in Section 60 where all I wanted to do was go home and be with my kids, right? Like that was
Totally understandable.
how am I going to focus for, we were out there before 7 a.m. How am I going to focus for the next 8 hours until I get home? So yeah, that kind of grief counseling and training, it's something I've carried with me. Uh, so those things have kind of fundamentally changed me as a person, um, from the perspective of what kind of historian do I want to be? What kind of stories do I want to tell? I think what I the biggest change, when I look at stuff I wrote in the early 2000s, prior to coming to Arlington, I much more prioritized logistics, operations, tactics, like the actual fight, and not so much. I would say I didn't do a very good job of weaving those individual or those personal stories in. And uh, again, it wasn't. I don't know when it happened, right? But I notice now that whether I'm leading a tour or just writing for my own blog, I really do try to weave in those personal narratives and anecdotes a lot more than I ever did before. So I think part of it is because you know I or as you said, like I really felt like I got to know the individuals buried at the cemetery. Like, I wanted to be able to tell their story. So it's not just one of the government furnished markers out of, so I think there are over like 240 or 250,000 grave markers, government furnished and private at Arlington, right? So yeah, how do we tell the story of these individuals so they're just not one of those marble slabs? But I think the other piece, and we also touched on this a bit earlier, is the audience. You know, being at Arlington, I really started to understand my audience is the public, the general public, the international audience as well. So when I write anything today, I think that is my focus and the kind of interpreter or storyteller that I want to be.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing the evolution and the I'm also really heartened to hear that the Army has a focus on grief and helping support people who are working in such environments with grief work because it's important and it's necessary. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The idea of remembrance is one I've thought a lot about. And one that I've learned from people like you about in kind of the experiences that you've had that you've shared with me through this podcast or other conversations. And on one hand, we can say we will remember them or they will not be forgotten or never again or these kinds of phrases that work really well as hashtags also on social media because on the surface level, the fact that a place like Arlington exists means we won't forget these service members. So it's sort of implicit in the whole concept is that we have this national cemetery where we're not going to forget the service and sacrifice of these people. However, to truly not forget, we have to know them. We have to do this type of research. We have to dig into the archival materials or other sources so that we can, in some ways, recreate their life. And in doing so, at least I found for myself, I then think to myself, well, that means I may not be forgotten. So it feels that we are almost preemptively remembering ourselves because we recognize if we are dedicated to remembering others through bringing their stories alive and through talking about their families or the context in which they live that we ourselves may not be forgotten. And I think that's reassuring, and I think it's also one way of coping with working in this space.
Yeah, very well said. That's I there have been a number of times, especially when I was having a bad day, right? Like, well, maybe it was just a 2.5 hour commute getting into work. And as I was driving to my office through the cemetery, one, I realized, well, the commute really wasn't so bad, but it would get me thinking about, yeah, who will remember me? What will they remember me for? And, I think like part of that too is something I've struggled with just since I've retired, because, I invested so heavily in my career, especially my time at Arlington. So I've often wondered or have thought about that kind of remembrance piece, and I don't know that I'm necessarily at peace with it, but yes, I am hopeful that someone will do the same thing for me that I've done for them.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of it's kind of depressing to even think about. Let me find a way to transition out of that one that I just created for us. One of the ways that you've also remembered, service members and leaders, soldiers, if we're talking about the army, is through your long history of leading staff rides and preparing staff rides. And I've talked to a lot of people on this podcast about the concept and sort of the outline of staff rides. And I mean, there's a protocol and they're prescribed in some way. So there's a manual, at least the Army has published the staff, is it the staff ride or staff ride guide, which I would like to talk to you about. And then, so that's one kind of activity that's happening at battlefields. And then there's also battlefield tourism, which isn't necessarily a staff ride, but could be. And in the Venn diagram, they kind of intersect. And then there's battlefield pilgrimages, which also intersect. And I've been thinking a lot about how all of these intersect with each other. Um, and also have been thinking about how the staff rides that I have been fortunate to be involved with I've brought pilgrimage expertise to these, but I also have psychological expertise, which sort of comes in, I don't know, from through a side door, and thinking about, wow, there's such an opportunity for prescribed staff rides. So now I'll just launch back over into this little bubble to include more psychological information. And I didn't know until we started talking that you were involved in the evolution of this guide. So I want to hear about the history of it, and then I want to hear about your thoughts about, is there a place for more psychological information, or is that something else? Does that then flow into this other bubble of battlefield tourism?
Right. Yeah. So the uh, kind of the history, right, of the staff ride program in the Army, uh, you really it picks up in the turn of the century, like basically, I'd say about 1902 or so. Uh, in 1890, the 1890s, that's when the first national battlefields were established that ultimately the Department of War, the War Department, would administer. And the very first one, Chickamauga and Chattanooga, right? Part of the language of the establishment of that national battlefield is, it's not just for remembrance and marking the lines and those kinds of things, but it's for military development, right? It is a classroom, and so from the genesis of like the national battlefields, the idea that the army would be able to use these as training, started to take shape. In 1902, the reason I call out that date is Elijah Root, as part of his reforms, had the first classmen at West Point go to Gettysburg. And so I think those kind of early trips of those cadets, it was kind of a combination of education and pilgrimage, right? Because I do believe that part of Ruth's intention was to get those cadets to understand, where they came from, what were the struggles that led to the point of where they're soon to be commissioned as officers in the army. And then the first kind of staff rides, as we would define like the staff ride, started to occur in 1906, and those were actively used all the way through, up to World War One, and then even after World War One, the U.S. Marines went and did a bunch of pilgrimages, right, to battlefields, like to include Gettysburg, and there definitely was veterans from Gettysburg were there to talk to them, and etc. So the history of them is really interesting, the early history. And then between World War II and really the staff rides just were kind of fell out of favor. They weren't used very much, if at all, across the army, and certainly individual units weren't going out and conducting those events. And same thing. There weren't kind of organized staff ride experiences through the Army War College or the Command and General Staff College. So that's really when people started to talk about, like, let's reinvigorate this program. This is a value for, a whole multitude of reasons that we could talk about. So how do we kind of reestablish the staff ride in the U.S. Army? And that's where the staff ride guide, the first one, which was published, I believe it was 1987, uh, was sort of the manual for. Uh, it provided the framework. So for an expert, I guess, like, so someone at the Command and General Staff College or at the War College, to go ahead and lead a staff ride for their classes. But more importantly, it was sort of the how-to guide for units, to go ahead and conduct their own staff ride wherever they were in the world, whether it was a European battlefield, it was something here in the U.S. or anywhere else around the globe where they might have been stationed. When it was established, there was a real division in what should a staff ride look like between the U.S. Army War College, which Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania, and Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. The War College model was very much focused on after action reports, right? So since most of the ones the War College was doing, because of the access to battlefields like, Gettysburg and Antietam, either one of those they could hit within 35 or 40 minutes from their location, was to use the ORs, the official records of the War of the Rebellion, and pull out the after action reports of those who fought at each one of the physical stands or stops that group was making. And that methodology was really focused on, well, the leader, whoever's leading it, is just going to read the after action report. And then sure, there could be discussion about what that leader, what decisions they made or didn't make, or run through some what ifs, those kinds of things. But, aside from like orienting, that's north, that's south, that's east, that's west, blue force was here, red force was over there. Uh, there wasn't much, description, and there wasn't much discussion about what occurred there beyond what was in those after action reports. The staff ride guide is based more on the Command and General Staff College methodology, which has three phases of study and really kind of lays out this is what a good staff ride looks like, right? It's not just about reading primary sources and letting the group discuss. It's providing the framework and the context of that battle, or of what was occurring at that stop or at that stand. So I think it's instructive, or it's important to look at the staff ride guide for what it is. It's like that step by step method that if a lieutenant, and I've worked with a number of them, a young lieutenant, sometimes a captain, boss wants to do a staff ride and they say, hey, you're the stuffy. I want you to plan this out and lead it for us. Um, if they weren't able to, because of their locality in the National Capital Region, if they weren't able to reach out to someone like me at the Center of Military History, or the staff ride team out at Fort Leavenworth or at the War College, um, it provides them kind of everything they need to know to go out and hopefully put together something that is useful, and meets the intent of that staff ride. So I think that's where, when when we talked about like the psychology of this, whether it's the psychology of decision making or leadership, or you're right, it is a massively missed opportunity uh, in that manual, in that guide, to be able to provide sort of the next level, or instead of just getting there and walking through like what ifs, or talking about, well, why did this happen? Here's a brief description of what happened, but why? Why did it happen that way? It could be so much more nuanced and layered. But again, the purpose of that guide is just to serve as, so someone who has no real knowledge of what's going on, it's like literally they're just getting told to put this event together. It gives them that easy to use how to guide. I think that for uh, a really meaningful event. Well, let me say this too. Just thought of it. The other thing, it does come down to a timing thing as well, right? So the more complex a battlefield is, the more time you're spending moving from spot A to B to C to D. Uh, you really do get into a time crunch, and as a leader of one of those events, it is easy to start falling into the trap of, okay, well, let me just tell you what happened and I'll give you my analysis and then we'll move on to the next one. So it really does take a lot of discipline to ensure that you're spending enough time and giving enough opportunity for the discussion, which hopefully then will really impact the integration, phase and the reflection for all of those attendees. But I, I would say on an average in a staff ride for an Army staff ride, the ability, the knowledge or the time to really delve more deeply into like psychological theory, it's often not present, right? And that's why it's such a luxury. Like when you do have a group that's like, oh, we want to do a 3-day Gettysburg staff ride, or we'll do an Antietam, but we're going to, one day will be the battlefield visit or the terrain walk, but the day before we'll do like an integration thing, or I'm sorry, a preliminary study thing, and the day after, we'll spend half of the day doing some integration. Those are really I think where there's the big missed opportunity to get in some of those additional layers. So hopefully that helps. And of course, basically every iteration of the staff ride guide since that original in 1987. I mean, it's keeping that same kind of. It really is a how-to guide for the non-specialist.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I can envision, well, a couple thoughts come to mind. One, it's not surprising to me to hear that the idea of staff rides bubble up in the 1980s. And I mean, if I look at across the kind of the education um, sector, there is a growing interest at that time in experiential education. Study abroad is becoming quite popular. And so it would make sense that the Army would say, there's probably people also who are in these sectors coming into the Army, or people in the Army are having experiences as students at a university, they're studying abroad, they're thinking about how transformative that was. And so that makes a lot of sense that the 1980s is the decade where the staff ride kind of rides back in as being an important part of professional military education. Another part of what you're saying around the time, I also recognize that very often people are in positions and their boss says, here, go do this. And there's not a lot of time to be able to plan or research. And that's the whole reason CMH is existing, is to be a resource for this type of thing. So it makes a lot of sense that the Army would create a manual, kind of a how to step by step guide that anyone could pick up and then reasonably um, be able to go conduct a staff ride. I think that from my perspective, now I'm an outsider. I'm not an Army insider. So what I'm saying, it can be taken with a grain of salt. Maybe someone will care, maybe someone won't care. But just in reading the manual and then having participated in a number of staff rides myself, I'm thinking there's some potential here. One potential could be to have a military psychologist accompany the staff ride, or especially if they're happening within educational institutions, it's grab a psychology faculty and put them in the group, or for future editions to include, you and I were talking before we started recording, maybe an appendix of resources, or including some citations around, meaning making or decision making. There's a very robust body of literature within the psychology space about this. Even information around neuropsychology and how the mind changes literally because of traumatic brain injuries. I mean, this impacts decision making. So, I mean, that's sort of a niche example, but it's an example nonetheless of how there is this amazing body of literature that could easily be incorporated into a future edition. And then also, I mean, especially with this integration piece, but I do think it's important on the second step too. It's important to understand the psychology of people who live at combat sites. I mean, I'm thinking about the World War I space in France and the impact of combat to local villages, and this kind of collective trauma or intergenerational trauma. It's still present. And being able to incorporate information around that, I think, is also important when we think about future conflicts and how the local people that live at these sites are going to be experiencing the military action as civilians.
Yeah, so everything you're saying resonates with me. I'm a child of two psychologists,
You are.
so
So you're getting,
yeah,
yeah.
I get it. Just when you mentioned like the TBI, um, yeah, my mind immediately went to Joe Hooker at Chancellorsville when a shell, impacts the front, porch portico of the as he's standing out there and he's knocked unconscious. And you look at some of the decisions that he made in the wake of that, yet definitely doesn't seem like, the fighting Joe Hooker that a lot of people kind of imagine in Civil War, lore and stories. So yeah, it's so powerful. Or someone health wise, AP Hill at Gettysburg, or another piece I've always thought is really critical was Lee, Robert E. Lee, and his decision making at Gettysburg, especially on day 3 with Pickett's charge. And one of the questions I would always throw out to my groups is, Lee's belief that 11, 13,000, somewhere in that range, men are going to make a march across at least a 1 mile open front, and they're actually going to be able to break the U.S. line and somehow exploit that breakthrough makes not a lot of sense, especially if you see it. So, what was involved in that decision making? Is it truly that by this point he had become so seduced by his own enigma and the invincibility of his army that he thought they could do anything? Was it based on experience? Well, in the past, when I've attacked, the U.S. force has crumbled, you know, not kind of understanding all of the changes that the U.S. Army had been going through in, geez, even the month lead up to the battle at Gettysburg. So y- yes, there are so many opportunities there, and I do believe that at least introducing or providing the resources to someone who is planning that event, that staff ride would be such a powerful tool to really help um, and aid that discussion and the analysis of what was actually going on and relating it to right and modern and future wars. I mean, like I think about Mogadishu, or again to bring up Mogadishu, you know, what the psychology of those rangers and Delta operators were, that literally they were prepared for a 60-minute mission that went absolutely uh, sideways. Well, maybe from the beginning, but with the shoot down of not one but two heroes, um, and them having to stay in the fight for it, until the next day, the next morning.
Mhm.
Yeah, it is it to me. It seems like just referencing the psychology of leaders in the manual isn't enough for, yeah, at least for, the average kind of soldier, the average officer that's going to get tasked with putting together this type of event.
Well, especially when we know the mechanisms of leadership. I mean, we there's enough research, around the mechanisms of the psychology of decision making. I think it takes it a bit deeper. We know this information. We don't actually have to be so broad because there's structure that scaffolds this greater psychology of leadership.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, you had mentioned it, I think, earlier when we were discussing uh, another piece of that is sort of the belief that, well, if you are a senior leader, and look, I've run through this through like with my corporate customers as well when I've done tours for them, et cetera. But there's that belief, well, everything, or that, this group, because we're all senior leaders, we're experts in all of these things and all of these mechanisms, which personally, in a few cases, I've been wholly incredibly impressed. But in a lot of other situations, not so much. Right. So there is that. Yeah, there is that as well. And again, I'm not singling out the army or the military. I'm just singling out senior leaders in general.
Yeah, I do think that there can emerge over time and with decades of experience a little bit of uh, I should say a lack of disciplinary or humility or expertise humility. And I think that it's important to remember that we don't know everything, even though we might be experts in one thing. So what's next for you? You've retired as a command historian. I heard you say that you're giving tours, corporate tours, maybe individual tours. Do you plan on remaining focused on staff rides and commemoration and military history, or are you up to other endeavors now?
Well, one of the first things I did after I retired was I started my long thought about blog called Vinnie Bellum, aka The Grapes of Wrath, Warfare and Wine. So I had this idea of would have been over 20 years ago now when I did a Caporetto staff ride. I was at a conference in Slovenia and we did a Caporetto staff ride basically all the way down to Venice or close to Venice when the Italians stopped the Austro-German advance. And look, the staff ride part was great and talking, Rommel's early experiences, and that was really cool. What blew me away were all the vineyards that we were driving through, located on both the Slovenian and the Italian side of the Julian Alps. So I had this idea of uh, focusing on a battle or a campaign, uh, the history of it, and then talking about the wine regions that fight took place in. So I had been keeping myself occupied doing research, um, so archival and drinking, actually sampling the wine of the region. So that is what I'm kind of doing to stay in practice of research and writing, and if I ever get good with editing, maybe even a podcast someday. So that's my fun thing that I'm finally doing for myself. I did start a business, so I've been working on consulting uh, and professional development, leadership professional development largely. So I've worked a couple of history and museum projects over the last about 11 months or so. I finished work right after Memorial Day in 2025. So it's yeah coming up on 11 months now. So I've done some of that consulting work, uh, but my passion really does remain for the leadership development event, specifically tied with a battlefield. So I've been working on that, and recently I decided to kind of cast a little bit further of a net, and I've started my own kind of personal tour guiding services. Here in the DC area, there are so many opportunities, but um, I've got experience doing tours from New York all the way down into Georgia, essentially. So I've been working on some more tours, right? Versus like more of the staff ride. But what I try to do is bring that same rigor that I would use on a staff ride to a tour, whether it's at a battlefield or a city tour, where at least the groups are going to get a lot more than just what happened. I am much more interested in why did it happen and how did it happen, um, and of course asking questions and doing what if scenarios with them as well. But yeah, so I that's kind of what I have in my immediate future. But I am working on some longer form projects that I've put off for a long time, including one on the Mexican War. And I think there are still some voids in the scholarship, but also in an account that is really appealing to not just the specialist audience, but a more general audience as well. Because as you mentioned a bit earlier, uh, like Arlington National Cemetery, it is a microcosm for the history of the United States. The Mexican War had such an impact on the development of the nation, and what we know as the borders of this country today are all so immensely tied to, the history of that conflict and its outcome.
Mhm. Yeah, that all sounds fascinating. It's almost like you didn't retire. You
Almost.
just picked up a bunch of other projects and you keep going. Thank you, really, thank you for talking with me today about your vast expertise across military history in Arlington and the Mexican American War and all of your new endeavors. They sound super oh, and staff rides. That's always one of my pet topics that I like talking to experts about. It's really been a pleasure to speak with you, and I really appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thank you again for the opportunity. It was a lot of fun.